My name is Jacob Horton. I'm the Public Programs Coordinator for the NHA. Food for Thought is supported by the MS Worthington Foundation, so we do want to thank them for that. A couple of notes. We will be continuing the series throughout October and November, Thursdays at noon right here where you're at. So come on back for any of those. And for our other public programs that are going on, for example, we have a chamber concert tomorrow night. Check nha.org for details about all of those things. Please keep your cell phone silenced for the duration of the presentation. And if you need a restroom, it's right around the corner that way. Now, let me get to today's event. Michael Gaillard was born right here on Nantucket, but he has done a lot of his work in New York City for about 10 years after earning his MFA from Columbia University in 2010. His first solo exhibition was at Scaramouche on Lower East Side, but he also exhibits regularly here at Seven Seas Gallery. He's opened his own art gallery right around the corner at 2 South Beach Street. I encourage all of you to go stop in and take a look. It's remarkable images, really breathtaking. You're gonna be glad you stopped by. But I'm gonna let Michael take you through his work. So without any further ado, please help me welcome Michael Gaillard.
Hi everyone, thanks for coming. I'm going to kind of wing this presentation. It'll be a little more natural, not as stodgy. So I don't have anything specifically prepared, but I'm just going to take you through a few phases. The first phase is just going to be to talk about how I started getting into photography, which really began in Nantucket at Nantucket High School in the photography classes offered there, Rich Leone and Beth Morris. At the time, just playing around with black and white film photography, 35mm cameras. When I went to Stanford for undergrad, I continued to photograph with a 35mm camera, but it wasn't until developing a relationship with a particularly inspirational professor, the chair of the photography department at Stanford, who was himself a large format photographer. And he introduced me to large format photography. And at that point, I really found my calling, so to speak. It really seemed to align with the way I see the world and the way I operated behind a camera. It's a much more laborious process and a much more methodical process in the sense that it can't really be spontaneous, or at least as spontaneous as one using a handheld camera would be able to maintain. This is an 8x10 film camera. This is not the kind of camera I started with. I started with a camera that was 1/4 the size of this camera, but this is currently the camera I use to photograph. For those that are unfamiliar with the device, this is essentially the same type of technology that any of the geological survey photographers of the 19th century would have used, Timothy O'Sullivan and Carlton Watkins, and of course Ansel Adams later. My early influences specifically involved Walker Evans and his work, and he would use this kind of camera. The benefits of this camera is that it produces an image on a negative that is 8x10 inches. So that, as you can see here, this is where the negatives go. This is a film holder. This is a dark slide that keeps the film safe from light until this slide is removed, at which point it's exposed to light. The way it operates is you stick it behind the camera with the lens closed, and then remove this slide. There's still no light hitting the film, but it's completely light tight. At this point, I would have already gotten a sense for the light, perhaps gotten a light reading, although I don't really use a light meter as much anymore. Just kind of develop a sense for light. But then you click the shutter, and it exposes it, and hopefully it works out. The images that I produce, which you can see at my gallery and which you'll see in this slideshow, are actually finally produced as digital images. I take the negatives and scan them using what's called a drum scanner, which is the highest quality digitization technology available. It produces a very large file from which I then print an image at very large scale. That's one of the main motivations for using this camera in a technological sense, in that there's far less magnification. So as a result, the image retains its clarity in a way that would be very difficult to replicate with any other device, digital or otherwise. But there are other motivations other than just clarity and the precision that it avails. It's also the process of using this camera is very important to me. The way in which I see the landscape is really immersive when behind this camera, as opposed to seeing it in a little viewfinder or a little window. You're really seeing the whole image at full scale, at 8 by 10 inches. And it just changes the whole way you relate to that, as opposed to it being something very finite. It's much more, as I said, immersive. So I would encourage at this point, if anyone who's interested while I talk, to come up and take a look under this hood. You can see an image that I've composed of this view. You can see what it looks like. There's not a lot of light in here, so it's a little dark, but you will see it projected onto the ground glass. Definitely, if you haven't used a camera like this, I highly encourage it. It's kind of a neat thing to experience. I'm just going to show you how the shutter would work. So if I were to take a picture, I would cock the shutter, and then you might be able to hear it. So that just, if I had a sheet of film in the back and pulled that slide out, that would have just exposed the image. You'll see that I also have this little thing, which is a focusing device. It's ground glass focuser. I'll stick it on the back of the ground glass, and this will enable me to enlarge a little area to determine whether it's in focus. Focus is very important using this camera because basically any mistake is magnified as well. So if the image is not in focus, then it isn't a functional image. One of the other benefits of this camera is that it allows one to adjust the focal plane, so I can get very, very deep depth of field, not just by way of a very small aperture. You're probably familiar, a handheld camera generally just goes to a f/22 or f/16. Most of the digital cameras stop at f/16. This camera goes to f/64, so it's a much, much, much smaller aperture. And that allows for a much greater depth of field. In addition to that, by adjusting the film plane, I can make it so that the foreground on the bottom part of the image is in focus as well as the background in the top part of the image. I could do a diagram and explain how that works, but I'm not going to get into that detail. Another thing you'll notice when you see this is that the image is upside down, because actually in all cameras that's how the light travels through an aperture. It flips the image as it passes through the aperture. And a lot of cameras that have mirrors inside that allow you to see through the viewfinder the image flipped, and then when you click the shutter, that mirror flips up and it projects the image onto the film plane, actually upside down. In this case, there's no mirror, there's no apparatus. You just see the image flipped on the ground glass in the back. Honestly, anyone who wants to stand up and look at it, it's kind of part of my presentation. So I encourage it. It's no imposition. And then on the table, some reading material and some postcards. You feel free to take. I'm going to get going and just go through some of my images. I'm going to start with a trip I took last year to California. I flew into LA and out of San Francisco. As I said, I got my start with large format photography while at Stanford, so I'm fairly familiar with the landscape up in the Bay Area, but really hadn't spent much time in Southern California. And as you know, last winter was a fairly challenging one, so I really needed to get away and decided to leave and go to California and rent a car and just drive with no real specific ambition other than to photograph and to follow my nose. So without further ado, I've set this up chronologically, and it's kind of, I'd like you to observe how the way in which I'm seeing evolves. I think it has something to do with thinking about landscape in a certain way, and then doing so intensely over the course of those 2 weeks. I really started to exhaust my desire to present the landscape in a kind of grandiose manner, and became more interested in some details. It was never intended to be a complete body of work. It was always intended to be just a series of images that may lead to other more precise investigations down the road. And I still, to some extent, see it as that, as these all being threads of a variety of different pursuits. So you'll see some that might be more conceptual in nature, more abstract in nature, and then others that are more kind of conventional in terms of a depiction of landscape. Another thing, just a quick little amendment to the presentation. The projector is a little out of focus, but you get the picture. They're very, very precise in person, and so I encourage you, although my gallery is effectively closed for the season next summer, please come by and see the work in person. This is just north of LA, looking eastward. So, yes?
So I'm surprised that these are colored. I thought that there was a problem now developing color print. Cameras not being colorized.
Well, I don't develop them myself. There's still a bit of a boutique industry out there. Because it's a boutique industry, it's much more expensive. By 10 aspect ratio. When I teach classes, I think it's really important to see and envision the image as it's intended in advance of any sort of processing or development. I think ultimately, and a lot of photographers would probably echo this, if it wasn't seen properly the first time, it's probably never going to be right. And I think, given the limitations of film, the fact that it's a finite, I can only take 20 images in one. I have 10 film holders. Each one of these film holders carries 2 sheets of film, so I can only take 20 images before I have to go into a dark room, take out that film without getting exposed to any light, and put new film in. So it really limits the amount of images I can take, and therefore compels me to be very certain that each image I take is what I want to take. And I think, although this can be done with digital, the translation required to imagine what the world looks like when converted into 2 dimensions is really important for the visualization of the image. And when people have digital at their disposal, they can take thousands of images and just pick from from that collection. And ultimately, I think that takes away some agency and some intention. Thinking that, oh, I see something's going on here, I'm just going to roam around and photograph and then choose later. and then maybe even crop it. But cropping also affects the relationship of the objects within the image. It functions as it would if you were to put a zoom lens on the camera. It kind of takes an extraction from the view and flattens everything. You kind of zoom in. It's the same thing, just at a different point in the process.
The last one.
Yeah.
How long does that take you to get that shot? And how, like, you didn't step off the road and set up?
I did. Yeah.
Okay. So you're not moving because you don't have the zoom on it, correct?
I do not have a zoom. I use one lens.
So when you're framing, what really determines your right and left frame? Just your eye, or is there something in that picture that's...
I mean, saying just my eye is maybe not. I mean, there's a lot that goes into the eye, in quotations. It is my eye. There's a feeling. There's a familiarity with the medium. There's a familiarity with how it'll translate. I mean, there's a balance there. You know, I consider compositional balance, and I consider the way it functions. Again, the biggest thing to consider is how a space will translate into 2 dimensions, how it will be rendered. I mean, an image essentially is 2-dimensional, but the image you're taking it from is 3, and that's a major shift. I started with black and white, which takes it to another step where you're considering how color will transition into tone, which is another reason why I believe that using film, and specifically starting with black and white, is really important for a photographer's development, to develop that capacity to translate 3-dimensional space into a 2-dimensional object. So, I mean, basically what happens is I get a sense for something going on, something special that's happening, or, you know, I'm driving along and I just have a feeling that there's something in that area that I need to capture. And to the best of my ability, I'll pull up the vehicle. You know, you can see I have a lot of stuff, so I'm not roaming around in the woods with all this stuff. I have a car, generally, and I have my camera set up partially off the tripod, but set up, as you see it, sitting co-pilot. And I park the car and get out and maybe kind of roam around, get a feeling for the space, and generally within the next 10 minutes, I'll place the tripod and take the photograph. My experience has been with the images that involve more roaming around, kind of seeking the final image. Generally, those images don't wind up working out because there's clearly something that was inadequate about the scene that I was, you know, looking at or envisioning. And so most of the time, the ones that really wind up working out are the ones that I knew were going to happen, and I put the tripod down, and it's almost exactly in the place I wanted it to be. I take 2 images. I take 2 images of the exact same perspective with very slightly different exposures, just to make sure that I get it right. This is a more conceptual endeavor involving the placement of a gray card in the landscape in Joshua Tree. This would be part of a different sequence of operations, more of a kind of contemplation on the medium of photography and the artist in the landscape. Another example of an image that would occupy a more conceptual space. I encourage you to note that the landscape, this mound, is fusing with the ridgeline in the back. So there's this kind of play between my agency as the photographer, my decision to take this image, as well as the fusion between this man-made pile and the landscape behind it. Well, for this camera, I use a 360 millimeter lens, which is essentially the equivalent of a 55 millimeter lens on an SLR, or around a 90 on a medium format. And the reason I don't use many different lenses is because there's one way I see. I see in my mind's eye is is at this point aligned with the focal length of that lens. So to have multiple options would kind of speak to what I was talking about before, about just kind of taking infinite scenarios within one context and then deciding later. I'll go closer or farther away if I want to get the image. Agreed. Exactly. 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 I agree. Hmm. Yeah, I absolutely agree. I mean, it's a feeling. It's a sensation. When I'm fully engaged and fully immersed in the act of photographing, there's instinct plays the largest role, um, and a certain there's just I'll be driving along and I almost get in. It's pretty dangerous. Ideally, I would have someone driving and I just say turn, turn. But unfortunately, I have to do both, and sometimes I cross over 3 lanes to an exit and pull over. This is an example of an image where the light was just right and I just knew there was something around. And this is an example of an image where the light was moving so quickly, there was only a few minutes left. Oh, God, it's so out of focus. But anyway, it's killing me. But I had no time to arrange this image. So I just put the camera down exactly where I knew I had to go, and I took the image. But if you'll note, using this device and trying to get this image without having developed a real kind of synergy with the device it would take a very long time. But now it actually doesn't take me that long. I have such an intimate relationship with the apparatus. So as we go through this is moving north through the landscape of California. Some of them will call attention to some relationships to the landscape of Nantucket, but ultimately I'm responding to the landscape in a unique manner. When I photograph Nantucket, I'm responding to it as I know Nantucket. And so the images I produce here in California are going to be distinct from the images I produce in Nantucket in both content and feel. There were flies biting me on this photograph. It was very uncomfortable. So one of the most important components of my landscape photography is that it accepts the two-dimensional form. As I was talking about translation, it's really important that there's a kind of an oscillation between depicting infinite space or three-dimensional space and assuming a flatness, and that's where compositional decisions come into play to allow that fluctuation between representation and abstraction, where compositional elements can serve to function that gets to the heart of both the artist taking the picture as well as, and probably more importantly, the audience of the image. And in his case, there was an image of his mother on a bridge, and he didn't think about the image. It compelled him beyond that to all these memories of his mother. And I think that's something that's always in my mind when I'm photographing, and specifically when I'm photographing in Nantucket, given that Nantucket is my home, my native home, and I have a particular relationship to it, as do all of us. And when I first started photographing in Nantucket and started considering it as a commercial endeavor to some extent, I named my my website Your Nantucket, and that wasn't accidental. The idea behind it was to produce images of Nantucket that compelled one into a reflection on the particular nature of one's affection for place, specifically this place. And rather than photographing iconic images of what one would consider to be archetypal Nantucket, I decided to photograph in a way that would reveal, I don't know, the essential quality of being in Nantucket, the air, the light. So we'll move on. That's the series of California works. As you can see, it kind of got more and more abstract and more removed from its context, from its specific context as I went on. And I think that had a lot to do with my exhausting my desire to depict these grandiose landscapes. We're going to go quickly through a few images I took in Costa Rica just to give you a sense of how I respond to the unique landscape of Costa Rica versus California versus Nantucket. And you can see that the images I make in these distinct places are entirely distinct. And I'd also like you to keep in mind that these images are intended to be seen at this scale. This is essentially the scale of the final product that I produce. On to Nantucket. This is a very good example of that oscillation between abstraction and specificity that I was talking about. You can see that there are essentially three planes, three fields of color that operate in an abstract and compositional sense, and create a whole, this whole in this image. But then in addition, there's incredible specificity. You can see every grain of sand and every, and the details in the grass and Great Point in the distance. My grandmother was on this trip with me. She witnessed me take this picture. It was the first time in 60 years she had driven to Great Point. So this is an example of what the large format camera allows for. You can see the sharpness in the foreground, and then the sharpness, well, relative sharpness, not on the screen, but anyway, the sharpness on the horizon. That's something that would be very difficult to achieve with a conventional camera. No, the aperture is often at f/64. It's the smallest aperture you can have on. I mean, there are smaller apertures, but that's much exponentially smaller than what you could have on a normal camera, which allows for much greater depth of field. In addition to that, is what I was saying, is that by adjusting the plane of of the front standard, I'm changing the focal plane of the image. So instead of it just focusing on a cut that's parallel to you, that's completely parallel to you, and perpendicular to the ground, you can adjust that so that the focal point is actually at an angle. I mean, you can do a lot of other things as well. You know, if there's a fence or something like that, you can adjust. You can do all kinds of things with this to adjust the way in which the camera focuses. And those are things that you can't do without this kind of camera. You see everything that you would see. It's a little more, if the lighting, if it's not a very bright image, it can be a little more difficult to see. And the effects are very subtle. So you have to kind of, you gain a familiarity with how much of an adjustment is necessary. And generally you just come to know, okay, I have a foreground 10 feet away from me that I want in focus. I need to move the front standard X amount. It really is. I mean, you can do a lot more. You can exaggerate to tremendous extents, but I tend not to exaggerate anything. It's a slower film. The slower the film, the more precise the image generally. The finer the grain. It's 160. So that coupled with, it's a 160. So that most people would use 200 or 400. It's not that slow. But that coupled with the very small aperture leads to an average exposure of around a quarter of a second, eighth of a second to a quarter of a second. This was late in the afternoon. It was probably about a quarter of a second, and that's why the moving people are blurred slightly. Well, so one of the problems with exhibiting it at an 8x10 size is that there's so much more information contained within that image that it's so dense with information that sometimes it's just, so there are a number of things, a number of ways to respond to that. One is just very functional, that the information is so dense at that scale that you would lose, it would have the effect of losing that detail because of that density. In addition, I would say most of my images are approached with the intention of assuming that much larger scale, which happens to not be as easy of a thing to do. Images falter as they enlarge generally. There are images that function in a small scale, and images that function in a medium scale, and images that function in a very large scale. And there's just subtle things that one does. I think most of them are more instinctive than than could be taught in a kind of calculated manner. But I'm ultimately intending for the images to be exhibited and appreciated at great scale. So this is an example. This was taken at about 4:15 in the morning from Steamship Wharf, and there was much less light than you see here. It was pre-dawn by about 20 minutes or so, but it was over a minute-long exposure, and so kind of cumulatively it became much lighter over that period of time. You can see this in the window of my gallery, and you'll note that anything that was moving is completely blurred, and has a bit of a painterly effect, while the land itself is, everything that's fixed is very sharp. And this was taken half an hour later, facing the other direction. This is the only panoramic image that I offer. It's actually two images fused together, so it's not an enlargement of one and then cropped. It's two distinct images spliced together digitally, and in my gallery, it's 10 feet wide. So I have a lot more to say, but I also would love to answer some questions or maybe see where that leads the last few minutes of the talk.
Thank you, Michael. Thank you very much.
Yeah.
So I know you guys were asking as you go through, but I'd like you to raise your hand so I can get the mic so it can pick up. Everybody can hear.
I just wanted to know, are they still making that type of camera?
This is actually a newly made camera. Again, a very boutique industry, but there are enough hobbyists out there that keep it alive. I'd say the fine art photographer contingent wouldn't keep that industry going, but there are so many people who I guess would probably even call themselves hobbyists who have a distinct interest in the history of photography and replicating images that were taken by Ansel Adams and other kind of photographers from early modernist period of photography. They'll mostly using black and white film to and often developing their own work and sometimes making their own cameras, but it exists, but in a very limited capacity.
Are your images limited edition, one-off? How do you market?
So they're offered in very limited editions, kind of at times too limited, but I prefer that. The largest size that I offer is an edition of 6 with one artist proof. The medium size, which is 40 by 47 inches, is an edition of 10. And then I have a smaller size, which is 21 by 25. That's an edition of 15. the smaller size really function as emblematic of the work I do, as opposed to being the work. At least that's how I see them. Like they're limited in what they can do at that scale, but you know, some people have limitations both spatially as well as financially. So I allow that to be offered as well.
Any other questions? Thank you all very much for coming. I'd like to thank Novation Media for making all of our digital presentation, all our lighting, and the video will be available on our YouTube channel. Thank you again, Michael.
Thank you. And just so you guys know, I have a web presence as well, so michaelgaillard.com, you can see all this work. Feel free to email me with any questions.